Hey guys, welcome back to the garage. Dan, Warpaint JKU, and as you can see behind me here, we have some Bronco envy going on. Funny thing, I walked into the garage this morning and the caster angle of the vehicle kind of rolled back a little bit too far, which caused the tires to do that. Because I don't have a tie rod, on Broncos it happens with their tie rod. But anyway, guys, here's the bottom line. I'm going to make a tie rod today, okay? There are some other factors, like I said, caster angle, things like that. We're not getting into that in this video. But if you've never made a tie rod, a drag link, control arms yourself, it is really not that difficult. It is a huge money savings to do it yourself. And there are a couple of tricks that you can do to make sure that it is even stronger and holds together even better during some extreme circumstances. So we're going to check it out and talk about them. All right, guys, and like usual in most of my videos, you're going to need some tools in order to initially set the toe on your freshly swapped axle. Now, this will also work on any axle if you want to do an alignment and set the toe. But for this axle, it's always easiest to take the wheels and tires off. Throw a couple of lug nuts on that don't have an end cap on them. That way you can put it on all the way and make sure that you're holding your rotor on nice and tight. Even if you have a brake caliper, you still want to do this because that rotor will move a little bit, and even a 1/4 inch will throw your toe off big time. But let's dive in. Let's take a look at the tools we need to initially set up the toe, and then we can start taking measurements for our tie rod. All right, so we need 2 clamps, basically one for each side. Obviously you're going to need a tape measure. Some people like to use 2. They also like to use the one that's kind of plastic. It doesn't really hold its shape like these metal tape measures do, but this tape measure will be just fine. A strap that's long enough for it to reach from basically where your tie rod would hook on one side to the other side of the axle, and a couple of long pieces of flat steel or angle iron. And that's really all you need, right? So we're going to get to it. We're going to set it up. I'm only going to show you on one side of the axle. You're going to repeat it for the other side, and let's get to it. Okay guys, so with this angle iron in place, again, if you're doing these kinds of projects, you probably have some of this scrap just laying around your garage. As long as it's long enough and it sticks out the front and out the rear just fine. They do make ones that you can purchase that install over the studs and go on with a couple of lug nuts. Those are sometimes a little bit easier, but this is cheap and it's what I have available, so I'm using it. It's time to basically take our strap and hook it up to the steering mechanism on our axle. On this axle, it happens to be a high steer arm that I welded on from TMR Customs. I'm going to basically hook it in one hole, hook it in the same hole on the other side. You could use your factory tie rod mount if that's what you're doing on your axle, but basically you just want to hook it up and basically almost use the strap as your tie rod to help dial in the settings, which we'll get to in just a second. So our next mission here is to basically set our toe. Now, the way we're going to do that is to measure from this point on our angle iron to the exact same point on the other side, okay? I like to go close to the rotor. That way I know I'm not throwing my measurements off by being too close on one side and then all the way out here on the other side. So I'm going to measure from here to the other side, and I'm going to try to make the rear measurement match the front. That would mean my front wheels are exactly parallel, okay? By doing it like this and taking the rubber off the tire, you can get a more precise measurement, and then you're not dealing with flex in the sidewall and things like that, maybe throwing it off a little bit. Because once these measurements match, we want to actually tighten the strap and pull it so that our front measurement is about 1/8 of an inch shorter than our rear measurement. We only want to tow it in about 1/8 of an inch. That's it, okay? Our measurement was a little bit towed in, so our measurement on the front was 66 5/8, and we were at like 67 1/2. So we're too short in the front. We're gonna lengthen it about 1/2 inch. Let's see what that does. That might have been a little too much. With our toe set, I was able to take a measurement after I basically assembled the heim joint. Now we're using heim joints as our end link. So I was able to put it in there with our misalignment spacers and then drop a bolt through. Now, this tube insert has threads on the inside, obviously, to screw it in, and what we're going to wind up doing is inserting this into the end of the tubing that we're going to cut for our tie rod. Now, the trick with those is to make sure that you have enough thread engagement for strength. Now, the rule of thumb with a heim joint, if you were using a 1-inch diameter heim joint, which would be enormous, right? But again, to make the math quick and easy, if it was a 1-inch diameter threaded section on that heim joint, you would want 1.5 inches of thread actually screwed in to the end of your tube as a minimum to maintain strength. So with that measurement in mind, based on our heim joints, as well as taking into account the thickness of our jam nut on the end, I left us some extra threads so we have good adjustment in there, and I took a measurement. And with the tubing cut to length, I used a flap wheel on an angle grinder to bevel both sides of our tube in order to make sure we get good weld penetration. So these are those threaded inserts that you just saw a minute ago on the end of our heim joints. We're gonna go over to our tubing, and you can see now how I basically ground down a little angle here on the side. It'll help us get some better penetration. And these are just gonna slide into the end of that tube. We're basically gonna lay a root weld right down in the deepest section in there, let it cool, do it in a few sections so we can go all the way around. Won't look as pretty as turning the tube as you weld, but it'll get the job done, and then we'll go back over and we'll fill it in. The tip that I had for everybody was to basically drill a couple of holes. I like to drill one at the top of the tube and then another one on the bottom of the tube. And that basically allows your weld to be plug welded into the side of your threaded insert as well as around the end. And it just gives it that much extra strength to make sure that it's not going to pull apart. Now, I don't recommend doing this kind of thing if you are new to welding. You need to make sure that you have a really good machine. No sacrifices can be made. A lot of people, when they first get into it, will get like a flux core welder because they're cheaper and they're easier and they're less of an investment. But a lot of those flux core welders will not weld something this thick, and you need to make sure that you control the heat, get the right penetration. The last thing that you want is your steering coming apart at 75 miles an hour down the highway. So again, I definitely do not recommend this for somebody who's new to welding, but this is the way that I do it. It's always worked very well for me. And of course, I always recommend wearing the proper welding gear and the Crocs. They're OSHA approved. First thing I do is put 3 tack welds in various places on each end of the tubing. Then I wind up laying that root weld, letting each side cool, and then going back and making the passes to final welding. All right, guys, and there you have it. You saw how to weld, how we basically filled in that plug weld, we laid our root weld, then I finish welded it all the way around on both sides. The only thing left now is to paint it, make it look pretty after it cools, and get it installed on the Jeep. This is how I made all of my control arms and my steering for war paint. It's how we're also gonna make the steering, obviously, for Maple Leaf. I've done it a bunch of times. It always works. You just need to make sure that you know what you're doing when it comes to the welding. And if you're maybe a little bit unsure, this is the kind of stuff that will kill people if it comes apart. So you need to make sure maybe you have a friend come over, help you out. But guys, this is a very easy way to save a bunch of cash. Just pick up some DOM tubing, threaded inserts, some heim joints, and away you go. Guys, I really appreciate the support. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and maybe give it a share to some of your buddies. And there's a lot more coming, so get out there and build something.